Fear the Full Moon, an Old World Saga novella by Joel Preston. This novella takes place after the Old World Saga Book 1 in the Shadow of Monstrous Things. For maximum enjoyment of this novella, it is best to have read the preceding book before beginning. Chapter 1. Flee. October 14, 2019. Cairns, Australia. Panic was the singular, overwhelming emotion flooding Jesse Bilyeu's mind. He glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the squat, tan Greek man in the back seat smiling at him. It wasn't a genuine smile, as the Greek's upturned lips carried relief, greed, and concern. The man was sweaty, and his stink climbed Jesse's nostrils and flooded his brain. He revolted Jesse in more ways than smell. Still, an impossible series of events had forced the pair together. Jesse breathed in deep as he turned hard right. His stolen vehicle skidded around the corner, briefly mounting the curb before straightening out on the highway. "Do not drive so recklessly. We will get caught before we have a chance to flee," the Greek tutted, as if Jesse was an impudent child. Flee, Jesse thought pensively. Flee to where, exactly? In the last 30 minutes he'd been bitten, impaled by a supernatural monster, shot the thing dead, knocked out a government agent, and was now on the run. These were not normal circumstances, and as such, he had no idea where to flee to. "What is your plan?" the Greek asked, sensing Jesse's inner turmoil. "I'll go home, see my girlfriend," Jesse mumbled, unsure. "There is no time. We should go to the airport." "No," Jesse stated absolutely. His clothes were soaked with blood, and they were in a stolen government car. They could be tracked too easily, and were too recognizable just to wander into the airport. Plus, the Greek in the back was in handcuffs. "I've got a spare key at home. We will change cars, and I'll unlock your cuffs," Jesse decided. This was good. A plan was forming in his mind. "You are a smart man, knowing I'm the only one who can help you now," the Greek grinned. There was that greedy and sinister smile again. Jesse's time as a cop had taught him not to trust people who smiled like that. As such, he didn't respond. It was true that the reason he'd wanted this car was due to the Greek's imprisonment in the back seat. He was potentially the only person in Cairns who, at least at this moment, didn't have the means to lock him up and turn him into a science experiment. The irony of the situation didn't escape Jesse, as it was only days ago that the Greek and his deranged accomplice, a man covered in scars, had kidnapped him. They'd lured Jesse to a seedy restaurant for an ambush, then taken him prisoner. He'd been tied up in an underground room and beaten. Why? To prompt Jesse's rescue by a friend of his, Joshua Dare. His kidnappers knew, much as Jesse did, that Josh wasn't an ordinary 23-year-old university graduate. The surreal truth was that Josh carried a curse that caused him to transform into a supernatural monster on the full moon. The Greek had been hunting Josh, as had the Australian government. Jesse, through what seemed like little more than misfortune, had become wrapped up in the whole mess. However, that wasn't strictly true. He'd let his paranoia build and put himself in harm's way. It was his fault his life was falling apart around him, at least in part. Josh had rescued Jesse, and, in the ensuing chaos, a different supernatural monster had come for them. Jesse had killed the monster, but not before it had bitten him, passing on its deadly curse. The curse was something from children's fiction, yet monsters in the moonlight had become Jesse's new reality. This time next month, Jesse would become the creature he'd killed. A werewolf, a creature from myth made flesh. A horror that now lurked somewhere deep inside him. "To the airport," the Greek demanded, shaking Jesse from his train of thought. "Why the airport?" Jesse asked, barely hiding the contempt in his voice. "The government men, or the police, will have you by the end of the night if we don't get out of the country." "You have tickets?" Jesse asked. "Yes," the Greek nodded. "For the Wolf of the Vatican and I." "To where?" "To the Vatican, eventually. We are going the long way around to avoid detection." "Where is the first stop?" "Vietnam." "Will I be able to use the Wolf of the Vatican's ticket?" "Yes. These are not ordinary tickets booked by an ordinary traveller, after all. All right, Jesse capitulated. He couldn't come up with any better options without time to consider the full circumstances, and time was a luxury in short supply. He checked the mirrors to ensure they weren't being followed by any sleek black cars or police cruisers. In doing so, he glimpsed the full moon shining high above. That damned glowing orb had caused all of the chaos tonight. With one hand gripping the steering wheel, Jesse ran the other along the myriad of fresh scars crisscrossing his body. His skin was marred where the monster had bitten him. The Australian government wanted to chain him up and use him as a test subject. The mysterious representative of the Australian Supernatural Task Force, Liam Sager, had told him as much. They'd already captured his friend, Joshua Dare, who'd gotten Jesse into this mess. He was not going to suffer the same fate. Over my dead body, Jesse self-affirmed as he slammed his foot to the accelerator. It only took minutes to reach Jesse's home. With a wild swerve, the car skidded to a halt beside his driveway. Don't move, Jesse ordered the Greek. Electronics, Jesse thought. He had to ditch his electronics. He didn't have a phone, as it had been stolen when he was kidnapped. Jesse hastily took off his smartwatch and threw it into the garden. Feeling foolish and unsure, he made for the entry. As he stepped through the front door, Jesse was confronted by his girlfriend. Her face fell when she saw the blood coating Jesse. Her eyes followed the significant scars on his exposed shoulder and arm. Kayla, listen, Jesse began, grabbing his partner on her shoulders. I don't have much time. Do you know where my spare handcuff key is? She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Go and get it, along with your car keys. I need my passport too. But why? Jesse tried to silence her with a stern look, the act proving to be a mistake. Don't you dare, Kayla breathed, her aggravation apparent in her tone. Jesse asked again, with a strongly emphasized please. The obvious concern, though somewhat hidden by the mounting anger, in Kayla's eyes was justified, as Jesse had been a viral sensation over the last few days, and not for positive reasons. His kidnappers, the Greek and the scarred man, had posted a video of themselves attacking the bound and tortured Jesse to the internet. If Jesse was in her shoes, he would not go anywhere until he had answers. I'll explain, I promise. Jesse struggled to hide his exasperation. Looking very confused and somewhat hurt, Kayla jogged off to find the items he'd requested. Jesse, meanwhile, sprinted to the shower. He had to clean himself up and change his clothes. There was no time to collect personal belongings, as he knew the police would be here any moment. It was a miracle that he'd beaten them to this place. It only took a minute to wash away the blood and get dressed. He pulled a long-sleeved t-shirt over his head and put on baggy jeans. Kayla burst into the bathroom with Jesse's passport, handcuff key, and her car keys. You got kidnapped, she howled, releasing her inner distress in a tidal wave of emotion. I've been so worried. What the hell happened? And now you just show up, all injured, without even saying hello? Jesse gripped Kayla in a tight embrace. I'll explain it all to you when I can, he attempted to reassure her. Explain now, she demanded, pushing him away. I can't tell you, it'll put you in danger, Jesse urged, reaching for the car keys. It's to do with your friend, Josh, right? You've been obsessed with him for a month. I know it was because of him you got kidnapped. Okay, Jesse relented. Remember how I told you about the night in Poker's Hill? About what really killed Steve? Steve had been Jesse's mentor, and had saved his life at the cost of his own. Kayla nodded, wiping away a tear. It was a monster, like I said. Now the government is coming for me, and if you know too much, they'll come for you too. The kidnapping, everything, was all about the monster. This is way bigger than I can tell you. Kayla did not look remotely convinced, but Jesse didn't have time. He heard the wailing of a distant police siren. I'll be back, Jesse whispered, kissing her on the cheek. Do me a favor. When they get here, tell them that I've gone south. You have to be convincing, okay? Her expression was utterly unreadable, but there was no time for further instruction. He darted out the front door, briefly looking back at the shaken and annoyed Kayla. Jesse opened the rear door of his stolen car and pulled the Greek out, quickly undoing the cuffs. The Greek massaged his wrists, which had turned slightly purple, then thanked Jesse. "Don't thank me now," Jesse murmured. "We aren't out of this yet." "What now?" the Greek asked. "We'll take my girlfriend's car to the airport. How long till the flight?" "It is flexible. We had planned to leave tomorrow, though there is a flight tonight. We expected to have been done with the well before now, so that was another option." Good. Jesse led the Greek to Kayla's small pink sedan. Against the rising backdrop of blaring sirens, Jesse left his home behind. As the old two-story house vanished from view, Jesse couldn't help but think he was leaving life behind as he knew it. He looked at the ominous full moon floating high above and cursed. He would face what was coming on his terms. Whatever horrors the next month would bring could be met once he was free. Chapter 2. Flight, October 14, 2019. By some miracle, Jesse and the Greek made it to the airport unimpeded. The Greek produced his bizarre tickets, stamped with the seal of the Vatican City-State, which skyrocketed Jesse's anxiety. One call to the federal police, and it was over for them. Fortunately, the Greek hadn't been searched by the AST, meaning his jacket pockets were still chock full of his belongings. One item was Jesse's police ID, stolen from him during the initial kidnapping. Jesse was able to leverage his role as a police officer to get them on the shortly departing flight. As the check-in person assessed their tickets, with more than just a degree of skepticism, Jesse couldn't help but notice that an odd man seemed to be keenly observing the pair from the far wall. He was tall, dark-skinned, and even from a distance, somewhat imposing. Jesse considered that he was a government operative stationed at the airport in case something went wrong tonight, but that didn't seem right. The stranger had a funny aura that seemed to chill Jesse. His face was cast with shadow, yet his eyes were undoubtedly fixed to the pair. Jesse brushed off his concern as paranoia from the night's events. The man wasn't coming over or trying to interact with them in any way. Yet, he continued to stare. Of more pressing concern were the airline staff. Jesse's cop sense told him that the check-in guy would report their suspicious arrival, but hopefully not right away. It wouldn't take long for the government to put two and two together, and deduce where the pair had gone. In a blur of time and corridors, they were checked in, through security, and onto the waiting plane. Jesse sat back in his way too small seat, his heart beating in his ears. It couldn't be this easy, could it? Jesse was a big guy. Standing at 6'8" and weighing 110 kilograms, he was a wall of muscle. It made airline travel uncomfortable at the best of times, without the added anxiety. He was tense, with dark pools of sweat dampening his shirt. He tried to breathe in deep and relax, but it was impossible. Every minute that passed before the plane took off intensified Jesse's panic. He was sure red and blue flashing lights were going to appear on the tarmac any second. Then, Jesse's stomach dropped as he saw a police vehicle zoom by, escorting a string of black government cars. It was over. He was done. The convoy didn't stop. They passed Jesse's aircraft, heading towards a large military cargo plane parked across the main runway. A large truck rumbled along shortly afterwards. The gaps in its rear cargo hold, where slivers of light could escape, shimmered with a silvery glow, like it contained an enormous gleaming disco ball. Jesse didn't need to guess hard to assume the truck's actual contents. His friend, Joshua Dare, currently lost inside the body of a monstrous black werewolf, was almost certainly in there. That hulking beast with its malevolent orange eyes was the government's main priority, not Jesse. Jesse breathed a sigh of relief as the plane sped into the skies away from Cairns. Their destination, Hanoi, was the capital of Vietnam. By sheer impossibly good fortune, they'd escaped the city cleanly. "Well done," the Greek yawned begrudgingly from the seat beside Jesse's. "I thought there was very little chance we would be successful. We have several other flights to the Vatican after we land in Hanoi." "We aren't staying at the airport," Jesse hissed at the Greek, ensuring no one around them was listening in. The Greek frowned. "It is important that we get to the Vatican as soon as possible. The government will be able to work out where we have gone very quickly. The Vietnamese authorities may be waiting for us on the other side of the flight. We get out of the airport into the city." "I don't like it," the Greek mumbled as he picked at his mustache. "I don't care," Jesse growled. "You need me now. No one else can help you. In 1 month you will become death-made flesh. You will listen to me. You will tell me what I need to know. Then make your way wherever you want to go, by yourself," Jesse stated absolutely. Once he was well educated on his new affliction, he'd happily leave the Greek to be recaptured by the Australian Supernatural Task Force. The Greek began to argue, but stopped when he noticed the person in front of them turn and gaze at the pair curiously. Jesse glared at the Greek. They both understood they'd have to put a pin in this conversation for now. It was going to be a long, silent flight for Jesse Bilyeu as he pondered this unexpected turn of events. Was his path now headed for the Vatican? Was he any better off there? He simply didn't have enough information to make an informed decision. "Whatever ensures my freedom," Jesse told himself. Then, Jesse was no longer aboard the aircraft. He looked at his fingers, though they weren't familiar. Gone were his large, calloused and brutish hands, replaced with those of a child's. "Hello?" Jesse squeaked, the voice appearing as a memory brought to life. It was dark and wet. Jesse was soaked up to his waist in swiftly moving water and could feel the chilly breeze whistling down the long concrete tube. While he couldn't see, Jesse could feel the iron bars pressed into his back. He was trapped in the unfathomable, cloying dark of the tunnel. His brothers had been playing in the rain, floating leaves as poor man's ships along the gutter and watching them descend into the storm drain. Out of nowhere, water had ripped Jesse from his perch and sent him careening into the blackness. He'd surfaced, half drowned in the abyss, forced against the iron bars by the strength of the current. He was alone, hidden from the eyes of those who loved him by earth, cement, and water. Something splashed in the tunnel, and Jesse cried. He was utterly trapped, unable to defend himself from the things that lurked in the deep. Even if he wanted to, the small boy was powerless against the rising torrent. With a squeak and a clunk, the plane touched down at Noi Bai International Airport. The shaking of the aircraft woke Jesse from his sleep. He was secretly glad to be free of the unpleasant memories manifesting as dreams. An adrenaline dump had caused him to almost pass out once they reached cruising altitude. He looked at the Greek, who appeared alert. It almost seemed like the Greek had been watching Jesse, as he quickly turned his head to avoid meeting his eyes. "What is your plan?" the Greek asked quietly, apparently eager to broach the topic of their escape again. "I don't know," Jesse replied through gritted teeth. Did the Greek assume that he'd formulated a plan in his sleep? "Luck will only take us so far," the Greek shrugged, a fact Jesse was already well aware of. Jesse looked across the aisle out the window and noticed through the grime that the tarmac was abuzz with activity. Small tugs trafficked large containers back and forth, while people in high-vis jackets attended to various tasks. It was abnormally crowded on both sides of the plane, and it was loud. Vehicle sirens were blaring as loudspeakers issued safety warnings. Jesse could use this. He just had to figure out how. One of the flight attendants, a small woman with a pointed face, noticed Jesse's interest and informed him that Noi Bai Airport was going through significant airside upgrades and that the passengers would have to be careful when exiting the aircraft because of high vehicle traffic. "There's enough noise down there to get lost in," Jesse thought as he hatched a plan. A couple of rows up, a particularly obnoxious couple were loudly debating the merits of social media pictures on their phones. It was clear they were influencers of some sort discussing how best to present Vietnam to their followers. Jesse turned to the Greek and rather loudly exclaimed, "I'm gonna start documenting this trip from the moment we get off the plane. I reckon you've got to begin the story with the plane on the tarmac." The Greek looked perplexed, but Jesse was pleased to see the girlfriend murmur her agreement to her boyfriend about his remark. Everything went like clockwork. Jesse made sure to stick close behind the pair, who promptly paused to take selfies on the walkway beside the plane. When they were swooped on by airline attendants in high-vis jackets, demanding they put their phones away, Jesse made his move. He grabbed the Greek by the shirt and pulled him behind a parked tug. The pair then ran the length of its long train of containers, moving steadily away from the aircraft. Another tug pulled in close, the driver noticing Jesse and the Greek, giving them a quizzical look. The driver would have shouted if Jesse hadn't sprinted up and punched him in the side of the head. It wasn't a measured response, but it was the best idea he had. The Greek hopped in the passenger seat, while Jesse, feeling quite guilty, left the unconscious man splayed out on the ground. Before anyone was the wiser, Jesse was cruising along the airport's perimeter road towards the distant fence. Feeling the wind in his hair, it felt like freedom. Any second the alarm would be raised, but they'd be gone before then. Jesse slammed the tug into the thin outer fence, damaging it enough that the two men could slip through the severed wires. Again, by some miracle, they'd gotten out. They slithered into a vast network of industrial buildings before stumbling across a road. Jesse managed to wave down a passing taxi, who gladly accepted the Greek's cash. "Where to?" the taxi driver asked, greedily eyeing the wad of money in the Greek's outstretched hand. Jesse stumbled over his words. He had no idea about Hanoi. Fortunately, the Greek interjected on his behalf. "Take us to a hotel near Tahien Street. Any will do." "Why there?" Jesse asked. "Famous nightclub and party area near the old quarter. Easy to get lost in." Jesse nodded his approval, and they were moving. A few blocks back from the loud noise and boisterous crowds of Tahien Street was a small, somewhat run-down motel willing to take cash for a quick room. The Greek and Jesse shambled up the stairs and pushed the stained yellow door open to find two mouldy beds against a water-damaged wall. The room reeked of stale cigarettes and looked like it had been hastily vacated, as rubbish was strewn across the floor. It wasn't glamorous, but it'd do. The Greek clearly wasn't impressed, as he turned his nose up at the place. However, once the door was shut, he forgot his disgust and rounded on Jesse. "We have delayed discussing this properly long enough." Jesse frowned, half wanting to punch the small man as he had the tug driver. The Greek was far more deserving than the airport worker had been. Jesse peered down at the short, fat, sweaty man without the merest pretense of trying to hide his contempt. The Greek had deep stains under his armpits and reeked of body odor. The Greek, on the other hand, looked at Jesse with unmistakable greed. Jesse was a prize for him to claim, and one he desperately wanted. "We got out of Australia. That's all I wanted to do. You can go wherever you want now," Jesse snapped back. "I cannot do that. I cannot return to the Vatican having both failed my task and without Dragon. What happened to him?" he demanded. Jesse frowned. He didn't know who exactly Dragon was, but could guess easily enough. "The skinny werewolf? He's dead. I killed him," Jesse retorted, surprised at the maliciousness in his voice. "But he got you. I saw the scars. You are his natural replacement." The Greek was positively salivating at the conclusion. "I am not a stooge of the Vatican. I haven't just escaped becoming the AST's prisoner to be a prisoner of a different kind." Jesse suddenly realized he was shouting. He swiftly moved to the small open window on the far side of the room to close it. He was forgetting himself. He wasn't safe here, and had to maintain a low profile. When he glanced onto the street below, he cursed his carelessness. A man in a black suit, with an obvious earpiece, moved with haste along the footpath. It didn't appear as if the person had heard Jesse, as he was chattering to himself quietly. A large white vehicle, looking to be a luxury four-wheel drive, was swiftly approaching the agent. The car stopped, and a very familiar person stepped out. With his thin frame, tan skin, and surfer good looks, Federal Agent Liam Sager couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. To see him here now set alarm bells ringing. Jesse swore. They'd been right on his tail the whole time. Jesse and the Greek must have only been one step ahead of them. "God damn it," Jesse murmured, pulling the curtain across the window. The Greek pressed his thin lips together into a frown. "Problem?" "The AST are here. They followed us." "They're good agents. They work quick." Jesse had to privately admit that the Greek was right, but was reluctant to dump more praise than was necessary on their pursuers. "I doubt they will search every hotel. They won't have the manpower. If we pay off the woman in the lobby, she will lie for us," the Greek yawned. Jesse considered this suggestion, then dismissed it. We can't trust that. We have to leave. You run from these men as if you are a sheep from a wolf. The Greek peered intensely at Jesse. Why? Jesse didn't particularly want to dive into the depths of his psyche with the Greek. He had his reasons for wanting to live free from iron bars in the dark, whether mental or physical. His experience in the waterlogged tunnel as a child had made him eternally afraid of confinement. He smiled at the irony that he accepted a job as a police officer, a role in which he put people in literal cages. That was different, though. Those people deserved it. That isn't important right now. I think it's clear that we have to get out of Hanoi. Have you got money? Jesse swiftly changed the topic. They have some US currency remaining, though not enough for a prolonged chase across Vietnam, the Greek sighed, as if Jesse was being ridiculous. Jesse ran his hands through his hair, feeling beads of sweat stick to his skin. They needed a vehicle. That much was clear. Loud voices in Vietnamese burst out from a room nearby, carrying through the wall as if it wasn't there. The Greek moved to bang on the flimsy foundation, but Jesse stopped him. Again, Jesse saw the potential for an opportunity that could be exploited. Give me money, Jesse demanded. The Greek eyed him warily, but did as requested. Jesse turned the slimy knob of their room and moved into the hall. He followed the loud, abrasive shouting until he arrived at another similarly seedy room. Jesse banged on the door 3 times, then waited. A small man emerged, dressed in nothing but his skin, looking utterly perturbed. His eyes were glassy and red from obvious intoxication. Jesse saw a scantily clad woman dart away in the background. Perhaps a prostitute, though it didn't matter. When the man looked up at the giant that was Jesse Bilyeu, confusion and fear crossed his face, briefly, before the same indignant rage re-emerged. He began to shout, but Jesse silenced him by showing him the American bills. English? Jesse asked. The man nodded unsteadily, holding onto the door to maintain his balance. Downstairs, on the other side of the building, by a white car, are white men in suits. I will give you this money if you distract them. Do you understand? The man nodded again, suddenly looking amused. He opened his palm, and Jesse thrust the crumpled notes into it. True to his gestures, the little Vietnamese man bounded down the stairs with surprising gusto, apparently unaware that he was stark naked. Jesse ushered the Greek to follow. They waited in the foyer. For what, Jesse wasn't sure, but he'd know it when it happened. Then, a series of annoyed shouts came from down the street. Australian accents were ordering someone to stop moving. A sound, suspiciously like shattering glass, reached Jesse's ears. This was the sign to move. Lead us towards Tahien, Jesse whispered to the Greek, who hitched up his pants, checked the coast was clear, then strode into the Vietnamese night. Resigned to this improvised plan, Jesse followed. They moved quickly and soon found themselves buried in an ocean of late-night revelers. Jesse stood out like a sore thumb, being so tall. He practically shoved people aside as the Greek led them into the beating heart of the nightclub district. The bright lights and loud music were disorienting. Several women suggestively winked at Jesse as they passed, making him feel even more obvious. If a government agent saw them now, they were done. A moped beeped, causing Jesse and the Greek to jump in fright. 2 men, on scooters of green and yellow respectively, were trying to weave around them. Give us a ride? Jesse asked the lead driver, practically shouting over the noise of the street. He'd been toying with the idea of potentially stealing mopeds, but this was even easier. One of the men turned to the other with a look of casual disinterest, then shrugged. It was as if such a request was a common occurrence around here. Where to? He asked Jesse cautiously. Out of the city, Jesse answered. Now wasn't the time to play games. The scooter driver shook his head. Then, the Greek produced a hefty stack of American bills, and the man's attitude changed. Hop on, he grinned, shuffling forward to make space for Jesse. The Greek didn't look pleased about this turn of events either, but hopped on the back of the other scooter regardless. Neither man fit well, Jesse due to his size and the Greek due to his protruding stomach. Jesse held on for dear life as they took off. The journey started slow, as they still had to get through the mayhem of the street. When the number of people dwindled, the driver let loose. The sickening roller coaster ride of the sharp turns and narrow misses made Jesse fear for his life. He began to wish he had a helmet, but that was a fool's wish. His life was now in the hands of the Vietnamese man he'd just met. Fear prevented Jesse from tracking the length of the journey, but before long, the scooter was pulling off the side of the road. The dark jungle loomed ominously on both sides of the highway. This place was absent even the merest flicker of a streetlight, indicating they were now well clear of the city. "You are out of Hanoi," the driver stated proudly, leafing through the Greek's money. He split the bundle in half and gave it to the other driver. "You're on your own now, though." Jesse privately thought the scooter driver's total disregard for their well-being was almost admirable. It was comical to the extent it was bordering on absurdity. He'd just dropped off some strangers in the middle of nowhere and couldn't give a damn. Without another word, they turned around and sped off, leaving Jesse and the Greek with nothing but each other and the darkness. "Well, this is just great," the Greek moaned, looking blankly at the wall of vegetation that confronted them. "We'll move off the road and find a clearing to sleep in. Hopefully we can start a fire," Jesse offered optimistically. The Greek gave Jesse a reproachful look, but didn't suggest an alternative plan. As they pushed through the gloom, stumbling over roots and feeling the slaps of the foliage, the Greek dropped his tirade of complaints to focus on not tripping. If a small dirt clearing hadn't quickly emerged, Jesse would have been tempted to give up. The all-consuming blackness of the forest mirrored his optimism. How was this his life? He'd been a cop. It was an ordinary job for an ordinary man. He'd seen a monster, been put on stress leave, been kidnapped by foreign agents, tied up and beaten for days, escaped and killed a werewolf, fled overseas, and now he was here, traipsing blindly through the jungle. When, at last, he saw the night sky above, Jesse wanted to collapse into a heap and sob. If the Greek hadn't been with him, there was a good chance he would have done just that. Pride was a powerful tool, and in that moment, it was the only thing keeping him going. The Greek proved himself useful when he managed to start a fire. It took several long minutes of him fumbling in the dark with a flint striker he'd pulled from his clothes. Sitting on the damp grass, bathed in the orange glow of the dancing flames, the two men finally had the opportunity to talk properly. The Greek wasn't waiting to judge Jesse's mood before he launched into another verbal assault. "So, this is your best course of action, to hide in peasant fields and forests of this country," he spat. "I need to think," Jesse retorted, his voice equally venomous. "Dragan Kudaviste is dead. You are his natural successor. As I have already tried to explain, there is only one place for you now. Return with me to Vatican City and see your affliction embraced by the church." Jesse frowned. The scar-faced man, this dragon, he was insane. The whole time you had me imprisoned underground, he was muttering religious dogma and laughing. That is not my future. Dragon came from a difficult background. The church gave him purpose and made him a weapon. But that is irrelevant to you. Bearers of the full moon curse are always cut from different cloths. You do not need to be what he was. You are cursed. But in that curse are gifts. Gifts from the old gods. "Gods," Jesse muttered, shaking his head. A log collapsed into the fire, releasing a brilliant cascade of sparks. The fire glowed in the Greek's beady eyes as he stared at Jesse. The Vatican pretends there is only one God, their God, but they know it is a lie. You will learn the secret histories of gods and monsters while you come to understand your gifts. And why are you so eager for me to go to the Vatican? Jesse shot at the Greek. I'll tell you why. You wanted to kill Josh and failed. Not only that, the Vatican's pet monster was killed by me. You want to take me as a replacement to cover up your failings. There was no hint of a lie in the Greek's eyes as he spoke. You are right. My failure will be met with harsh punishment. This, however, should have no bearing on your decision, as you have no other sensible options. In a month, you will become the same monster he was. Do you wish to kill the innocent because you were too arrogant to see the correct path forward? No, Jesse answered reluctantly. He ran his hands through his hair as he contemplated other ideas. His mind couldn't conjure anything that seemed like a plausible alternative. My name is Vasiliki. The Greek got up and offered his hand to Jesse. Jesse's mind was still reaching for a better idea. Anything would do. They won't lock me up, will they? Jesse asked Vasiliki. He was aware the question sounded pathetic, but it needed to be asked. Quite the opposite. The Vatican will unlock you. A better man will be born beneath the full moon, a man guided by the holy light of the church. Your work will be honorable. You will be crafted into a weapon, not a test subject. Jesse was so tired that he couldn't process Vasiliki's sales pitch. All that mattered was that the Vatican understood his new affliction. It was the one place he wouldn't become a test subject in a lab. To Jesse, that was a fate worse than death. That was being pressed against iron bars in the torrent again. I'm not agreeing to anything, Jesse began, standing up and grasping Vasiliki's hand. But I will come to the Vatican with you. Vasiliki grinned broadly, the firelight distorting his features horrifically. For a moment, he took on the visage of a demented clown with a large mustache. A branch snapped. Jesse spun as Vasiliki grunted in alarm. He could smell something. He could smell people. All around. The conversation had made him oblivious to the approaching danger. We need to go, Jesse whispered through gritted teeth as he began stamping out the fire. As if his words were a summons, men emerged from the undergrowth all around them. They were completely encircled. Torchlight shined right into Jesse's eyes, obscuring his view of the strangers. Vasiliki swore loudly in Greek and raised his hands. Identify yourselves, Jesse demanded. There was a hard whack as something collided with the back of Jesse's head. Chapter 3 Slave November 26, 2019 Vietnam. Jesse groaned as he stretched. There was a stifled, annoyed grunt as Jesse's hand gently hit the face of the sleeping man in the bunk next to his. Jesse didn't even bother to apologize. He didn't care for the other slave workers in the compound, and they didn't care for him. They figured because he was a Western man, he'd eventually be rescued, while they had no way out of this hell. By Jesse's best estimation, he'd been in the drug runner's compound for almost a month. He'd awoken in the back of a vehicle beside Vasiliki, bound in heavy chains and gagged. They'd travelled for hours through the ceaseless green of the jungle. To make things worse, once they'd come to the edge of a large river, Jesse had been blindfolded and knocked out again. The compound he now called home was old, decrepit, and powered by large generators that frequently failed. Not that power ever made it to the slave quarters. Armed guards frequently patrolled the perimeter. Jesse had counted at least 30, though noticed new faces would periodically emerge among their ranks. It wasn't a guess that drugs were being manufactured here. Jesse had seen what was being loaded into the trucks that were driven away in the dead of night. And it wasn't only common narcotics being trafficked. There were several large warehouses that Jesse hadn't been allowed access to that seemed wholly unrelated to the compound's primary business. There was also an out-of-place colonial-style mansion that served as the home for the bosses, shadowy figures Jesse hadn't yet laid eyes on. There were no modern facilities. Toilets consisted of a row of abhorrent long drops, while bathing was restricted to jumping into a nearby stream, under the watch of half a dozen guards. Due to Jesse's sheer size, he could never get in or out of the small toilet sheds without getting some loose fecal matter stuck to his clothes. Sickness ran rampant through the camp as mosquito-borne diseases wreaked havoc. There was no netting for protection as the evening swarm descended. Jesse was in hell. He'd run through scenario after scenario as to how he could get away, always finding an impediment to his plans. He'd drawn rudimentary sketches in the dirt and stolen what loose objects he could, but it was all futile. The key ingredient he'd needed over the last month was luck, and it was in short supply. This was a big operation, so the drug runners had clearly planned for potential problems. Fighting wasn't an option, as Jesse was weak from hunger. They were kept on the point of perpetual starvation, only offered runny oats and discarded fruit when the guards allowed it. The walls were tall and thick, topped with razor wire, and the main doors were lit with bright spotlights and guarded by a mounted machine gun. Save for a miracle, Jesse wasn't getting out that way. Jesse committed as much detail about the daily running of the compound to memory as he could. Such a vast operation had to have flaws to be exploited and weak links in its proverbial chain. It wasn't just the drug operation Jesse had memorized. Exotic animals were being trafficked or killed for their pelts, while boxes of military-grade explosives were moved in and out. These criminals had a diverse portfolio of illicit activities. The nearest thing Jesse had to a friend in this place was Vasiliki, and they were far from close. Jesse's obvious dislike of the man had led him to abandon using his name. It humanized the Greek, and Jesse didn't view him as human. By God, did he hate that man. He was the monster that had led Jesse to this awful place. Similarly, the Greek blamed Jesse for their capture and current situation. Jesse admitted to himself that the Greek wasn't entirely wrong, yet still did not feel entirely to blame. These were circumstances beyond his control. Jesse gazed up at the roof from his top bunk. The rusted sheet metal meant to keep them dry had been haphazardly placed, meaning water rolled in through small holes and fell into the shelter in small streams. At first, Jesse had found being perpetually doused as he tried to sleep a frustration beyond comprehension. But now it didn't bother him. He could feel himself growing bitter and resentful. He lay there, feeling the ceaseless drips on his scalp, wallowing in his misery. An obnoxious gong rang outside. It was struck 3 times, signaling the beginning of the workday. Along with the 20 other people who called the dilapidated shack home, Jesse shuffled out of bed and pulled on his dirty overalls. Rats darted around the weary men's feet as they made for the door. Jesse pulled it open and was hit with the smells of the rainforest. There were other smells here too. Machinery, cement and diesel. He didn't like it. A small man with a big gun began barking orders in Vietnamese. Since Jesse didn't understand, he was usually escorted to his designated workplace for the day. Sometimes he was hauling boxes, and sometimes he was packing unknown substances into boxes. Then, occasionally, it was construction work. Construction work was the worst, as the guards were the cruelest. There was no way to fight back. He'd seen several men executed for daring to speak up for themselves. Jesse hadn't bothered to mention the werewolf curse, and not just because he'd never be believed. The people who ran this place deserved a fate worse than the justice system could devise. They exported their misery to the world, taking advantage of the weak and stupid. Soon enough, Jesse would be the instrument of his vengeance. The grim satisfaction he took in this thought kept him going. The Greek, however, vehemently disagreed with this approach. A hunched figure bumped into Jesse. Hell enjoyed summoning demons for his torment, and had done so again this morning. It was the Greek who'd appeared. "Almost a month we have been here," he mumbled. The Greek looked like a shell of his former self. He'd lost considerable weight and was noticeably shaggier. He always had a haunted look about him that Jesse found amusing. After all, this was the man who'd held him hostage and beaten him. Karma had come quickly, though unfortunately, it had caught Jesse in its wide net. Jesse didn't say anything. "The full moon will be tonight," the Greek whispered hoarsely. Jesse shrugged. "You cannot be so cavalier with our lives, with my life," the Greek murmured, almost pleading. "What can I do?" Jesse shot back at him. "Attack a guard," the Greek suggested. "They will kill me. They may lock you up in a more secure prison. I am not going to die to save you," Jesse stated absolutely. For a moment, he heard the bitterness in his own voice. "Why not?" the Greek spat back. "Your life is pointless anyway. You were handed a gift from the gods and instead of taking good advice, squandered it. You are pathetic." Rage flashed in Jesse's mind. He grabbed the Greek by the overalls and flung him to the ground. A second later, Jesse's fist connected with the Greek's nose. A guard shouted at them in Vietnamese, then Jesse was roughly pulled off his squirming foe. He was led away from the crowd and towards a small concrete building. "What new nightmare is this?" Jesse sighed internally. A trio of men emerged from the building. the leader sizing Jesse up. "Big, strong man," he said in broken English, his gleeful tone impossible to miss. Jesse scowled. His offensive gesture was noticed, causing one of the guards to hit Jesse in the back with the butt of his rifle. "Strip him!" One guard pointed his rifle at Jesse's face, while the other unclipped his uniform, then tore off his shirt. It took all of Jesse's power not to fight back, and damn did he want to fight. Sweat dripped from his forehead as his clenched fists trembled with rage. The muzzle of the rifle, with its gleaming cold steel, forced Jesse to remember that he didn't want to throw his life away pointlessly. The leader stepped back through the door and quickly re-emerged with a weapon and an ecstatic grin. At 3 feet long, it was a plaited leather rope with 9 thin thongs dangling from its end. Each of the thongs was knotted several times. Jesse gulped. He knew this tool. It was a sadistic torture device known as the cat-o'-nine-tails. He was going to be whipped. The guards kicked out the back of Jesse's knees, causing him to collapse into the mud. He was swiftly forced into a kneel, then leaned forward in a macabre imitation of prayer. Jesse knew all too well that no gods were listening to the prayers of the damned in this place. As if by divine timing, the monsoonal downpour began. Jesse felt each cold drop as the ground turned into brown slosh around him. Jesse's hands were bound behind his back as a gag was pushed into his mouth. He choked and spluttered, causing the guards to laugh. It was a cruel, mirthless laugh that the concrete walls amplified. He could feel the rope strangling his wrists. It itched and scratched while the taste of the soiled cloth in his mouth made him want to vomit. Jesse buried his discomfort in a vain attempt at maintaining his dignity. The worst was still to come. He tried to brace, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming sensation that consumed him moments later. The pain was surreal. The 9 knotted thongs of the whip cut through his skin with extreme prejudice. Jesse doubled over, unable to breathe. His entire back seized up as fire shot through every nerve. It was incomprehensible. It was blinding. The mud was quickly mingled red with blood. Seeing nothing but white, Jesse struggled to inhale through his nostrils. The whip struck again, and Jesse collapsed. The guards righted him, and the process repeated. Over and over. The repetition did little to dull the impact of the whip. Its biting sting only intensified with each hit. As the whip shattered his body, Jesse longed for the cold embrace of death. It was better than this. Anything was better than this. Yet, all he could do was scream into his gag until even his voice left him. He could barely comprehend the annoyed voices of the men around him. They seemed perplexed by something, though Jesse couldn't understand what, as he was almost delirious with pain. Winded and trembling, Jesse was lifted back to his feet. "You here!" the leader shouted at Jesse, his voice a curious mix of confusion and annoyance. In his daze, Jesse groggily nodded, hoping for the ordeal to be over. He had no idea what the man meant, and didn't care to understand. Looking disgusted, the leader spat in Jesse's face. He then issued further orders, and Jesse was dragged away. As was customary, Jesse was given no time to recover from this vicious beating. Instead, he was sent into an area of the compound he hadn't been to before. He found himself beside the forbidden warehouses, or so he'd labelled them in his head. Jesse didn't even know if they were off limits, or if they just preferred him to work in other areas of the compound. Much to his surprise, the pain of his punishment didn't last. After 15 minutes, Jesse was fine, as if he'd never felt the brutal lash of the whip. How can that be possible? Jesse considered. He had, however, become aware that he felt incredibly seasick. His stomach was churning something fierce, growing in intensity as the seconds passed. He didn't have time to ponder this new conundrum. A guard pointed him towards a pallet laden with boxes. This man was half Jesse's size, with a thin mustache and terribly crooked teeth. He had 0 English ability, but Jesse didn't need an explanation. Apparently, he was to join the throng of malnourished men unloading the boxes and carrying them uphill to a series of waiting flatbed trucks. At least today's work was simple. Hours passed beneath the periodic rainstorm until something broke the monotony of the task. Noise appeared in the distance, like a familiar sound from another life. It was a far-off buzzing or whirring,
an aircraft of some kind. A helicopter. 2 sleek silver choppers appeared on the far horizon. They were coming in fast. As the unfamiliar vehicles zoomed ahead, Jesse could just make out the logo on each side. "I heal genetics," Jesse murmured, perplexed as to why such a prominent and well-known company would send emissaries to this seedy place. The helicopters were deafeningly loud as they skimmed the treetops, disappearing behind the canopy. They hadn't gone far, as Jesse could still hear the rotors whirring. He focused on the sound and tried to estimate the distance to the landing area. It couldn't be more than a couple of 100 meters away. Once the noise had dimmed, the irritated-looking guard began shuffling the workers through a large metal roller door away from the pallets of unmarked boxes. Jesse deliberately moved as slowly as possible. It was worth risking another beating in the hopes of catching a glimpse of whoever was approaching. He got lucky. Right before the roller door to the southernmost warehouse was lowered, Jesse saw a cluster of people emerge from the tree line. The group was fronted by armed guards in black uniforms. These weren't drug runners. The well-equipped mercenaries were escorting a tall woman with long black hair in a neat ponytail and a formidable-looking man with white hair and a square jaw. The pair looked European. The guard shouted at Jesse and shoved him through the roller door. He grew instantly frustrated. Maybe if these strangers saw him, they'd know he didn't belong. Maybe they'd rescue him. No, that was foolish. They were here to deal with the scum that occupied this compound. If anything, they were probably more dangerous than the Vietnamese criminals. The guard, unsure what to do with his workers, began directing them to random places to carry out menial tasks. Jesse was given a grimy cloth and a spray bottle, then asked to clean. To clean what exactly, he didn't know. Finding himself temporarily unsupervised, Jesse stole away into a series of small offices lining the side of the main production area. He wanted to see where the strangers had gone. The wild idea of following the path to the helicopters had occurred to him, but he was sure they'd be guarded. Jesse came to a dark stairwell. He figured that if he couldn't get out, he might as well go up. He walked as quietly as he could to a second-floor landing and cursed when he observed the lack of windows. There were more offices here, and they looked well used. Jesse's police sense told him that this place was important and that he probably shouldn't be here, which was perfect. There were binders positively overflowing with documents, and computers too. If there was internet, then he could contact the outside world. Finally, Jesse's desire to obtain knowledge about the inner workings of the compound had come to fruition. He scrambled to the nearest terminal and pushed the on button. What he discovered on the monitor was an operating system he'd never seen before. To make matters worse, the fluorescent green writing blinking on the screen was entirely in Vietnamese. Jesse cursed himself for allowing a brief spark of hope to manifest in him. He moved into the next office and found a crudely drawn map on the desk. The compound was clearly visible in the center. Some distance to the north was a small jetty circled in red. There was also a time and date noted. A delivery, perhaps? Or maybe something was being smuggled out along the river. Jesse scanned the room for a calendar and found one pinned to a corkboard beside the door. Each preceding day had a shining red cross through it, meaning he'd discovered today's date. The river delivery was 4 days from now. This felt like a wildly important discovery, despite his still not having an adequate escape plan. A female voice carried down the hall, causing Jesse to duck behind a desk. Oddly, the woman was speaking perfect English. It had to be the lady from the helicopter. They'd come here, meaning the guard, in his haste, had potentially shuffled the slaves into the wrong warehouse. The spark of hope suddenly flared into a small flame. Jesse could hear the clomps of boots as a small group strode into one of the offices down the main hall. He crawled forward, careful not to raise his head above the desk line. With stealth that didn't suit his bulk, Jesse crossed the divide until he was as close as he could get to the party without inviting his own discovery. Yes, he could hear them clearly now. The burly, square-jawed man spoke in a very matter-of-fact tone. "Can you fill the order or not?" Another man, though Vietnamese, responded in crisp English. "Yes, this is not our usual business though. It will take time to acquire, then move these materials." Jesse poked his eyes up like a crocodile breaching the surface of a waterway. "And you are certain that your associates won't be suspicious?" "Mr. Napier, please. This is the largest drugs and explosives manufacturing plant in Southeast Asia. No substance will raise eyebrows here, as I'm sure you knew when you requested our business. The man, Napier, grunted his satisfaction with the answer. Where are we directing the shipment? The Vietnamese man asked. Siberia. Details will be forthcoming when you have what we've requested. And if you don't mind me asking, what do you want with such an array of bizarre chemicals and rare earth metals? The woman replied as she scanned the room with a look of casual disinterest. Cutting-edge research. Science that is almost magic. In theory, of course. Right now, we are in a preparatory phase. And Moloch Tech can't acquire these items through more legitimate measures? Napier glared at him. Of course we could, but we don't want any of our business tracked. Why else would we be here, in this godforsaken jungle? This isn't my idea of a holiday destination. Is it yours, Mia? The woman, Mia, looked at the Vietnamese guide with a sudden gleam of interest in her eyes. Tell me something. I've heard that the Australian government has specialist forces scouring the Vietnamese countryside. Why would that be? The guide just looked at her blankly. This, however, greatly piqued Jesse's interest. Saga and the AST were still looking for him. They were clever and resourceful. No matter how well hidden this compound was, nor how complicit the government was in hiding it, he was sure Saga would find it. After being a slave for a month, becoming Saga's prisoner had now become the preferable option. Though, it still wasn't desirable. Curious rumours coming out of Australia recently. Hard to know what to take stock in, of course, Mia continued. I hoped you might know, but it seems not. The guide shrugged and stated, If what you're saying is true, we will ramp up our security as a precaution. See that you do, Napier stated coldly. Our boss hates interruptions. He has clients to keep happy, and he prefers to do it in a timely manner. Your boss being? The Vietnamese man asked impertinently. Never you mind, Napier grunted. Jessie watched Mia scan the office with a unique mix of curiosity and mild disinterest etched on her features. She was rake-thin, with a long angular face and a high brow. The man, Napier, was the opposite, solidly built, with eyes that carried the shadow of atrocities in their depths. I think this enterprise will suit us nicely. If Markovic can fulfill his promise to deliver us the wonders he has discovered, our work can begin in earnest in the coming months. So much to do, so much to obtain, Mia trailed off. You've said too much, Mia. Come, Napier snarled, annoyed by his colleague's flippant remarks. The Vietnamese guide directed the pair down the hall. They strode out of sight, leaving Jessie befuddled. Very little of that had been useful. Still, he was now armed with the knowledge of the coming arrival down the river, and that the AST were still here. If the stars aligned, there was a chance he could escape this place. In all the excitement of his eavesdropping, Jessie felt like he'd forgotten something important, but for the life of him couldn't remember what it was. It was fortunate that the conversation had ended there, as the sound of torrential, bucketing rain soon filled the building. The obnoxious chorus of slamming raindrops on the metal roof drowned out the possibility of hearing anything further. He retraced his steps and returned to the first floor, just in time to be noticed by the harassed-looking guard. The small man shouted at Jessie, directing him out of the warehouse and into the downpour. For the rest of the afternoon, the rain ignored the slave workers' pleas for it to dissipate and remained an unwelcome guest. As night drew its dark curtains across the forest, the clouds finally broke and unanimous sighs of relief were heard from guard and slave alike. Jessie was met with an unpleasant surprise. The man who'd whipped him in the morning was approaching, flanked by armed guards. He could only assume that his wanderings in the warehouse had been reported, and he was due another punishment. The leader bucked something in Vietnamese, and Jessie was promptly escorted away from the rest of the group. Jessie was marched towards the slave quarters, or so he assumed. The guards pivoted, and Jessie was turned away from the bunks towards the toilet block. Knowing better than to ask, Jessie went with them silently. When the first glimmer of starlight reached out over the trees, Jessie remembered the important thing he'd forgotten. The full moon was coming. The horror of this day wasn't over yet. It was only beginning. A peculiar locked shed sat at the end of the row of the stinking long drops. The lead guard pulled a key from around his neck and opened the door. A putrid stench flooded Jessie's nostrils. Even in the dim light, he could see that this was another toilet, though a particularly filthy one. Excrement was bubbling through the top of the hole, indicating it was beyond full. The internal walls and roof were also equally coated with the brown substance, as if someone had decided, upon seeing the overworked bowl, to spray the rest of the area with their waste instead. Barely visible among the excrement were thick chains with solid clasps on them. Jesse's punishment for his disorderly conduct wasn't over yet. Under the watch of the guards, Jesse stripped off his mud-soaked clothes and presented for inspection. Satisfied there was no way Jesse could escape, he was shoved inside. One guard gingerly worked to fix the clasps to Jesse's wrists, swearing as he brushed against the walls. Once Jesse was secured, he left. With a bang and a clunk, the door was locked. Standing completely naked, with his toes sinking into the feces, in total darkness, Jesse whimpered. Due to the hard day's labour, most of the workers would have fallen asleep instantly. Jesse had no such luxury. There would be no sleep tonight. He wouldn't even sit down in this horrid room. Jesse pulled hard against the chains binding his wrists, but they didn't budge. He was so weak and so dreadfully tired. His feeling of seasickness hadn't abated, and he was angry. He'd never been this angry in his life. But then, in this moment, his life had never been worse. Much like the bunk room, the toilet shack had a flimsy roof laced with holes. Through them, Jesse could see the black of the night sky. There were no stars here, just the dark void above. It was coming. The change. Jesse wondered how long it would take. Was the full moon sitting there in the night sky right now? Through the small gap in the roof, Jesse saw a white glimmer pierce the black canvas above. The world became fire. Hi, this is the author, Joel Preston. Sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger, but part 2 will be coming on Saturday, 13th of January, 2024. If you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, check out the Old World Saga, books 1 to 4, available now. Thank you, and see you next week.